button. All right, so for this week's session, as I said last week, we covered those high-level things about field ops that I feel like were very important for us to cover. Now we're going to really get into some granular level tips and best practices. In lesson 1, we're going to talk about some wonderful best practices when you're creating your questions and your responses. Lesson 2 will cover our visit form best practices, so the actual form and some of the tips and tricks that we picked up on that. And then lesson 3, we'll talk about visit completion best practices. Each of these sections is anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes as far as the lesson goes. So we should have some time near the end, as you can see, for some question and answer as well. And that's what we plan to cover today. Questions on that before I jump into the software? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so let's go ahead and, without further ado, jump into the software. Right. Just 2 seconds here, make sure we're ready there. So, like I said, the first piece of this training was high level. Today, we're really focusing on some much more granular topics, and we're going to start with some of our best practices on how to create questions and responses to those questions within field ops. So let's jump into that. So now, of course, last week we went into the admin section of field ops. Excuse me. And one of the things that we talked about was really utilizing these libraries, the media library, the action library, the question library, to really make sure that you are not reinventing the wheel. We're going to actually start in the question library so that we can go ahead and add a question. All right. So notice, of course, we talked about the categories and being able to really categorize your questions and allow for you to store questions appropriately. Today, we're going to go into that granular level. So I'm going to add a question here. And we're going to talk about our first tip of the day. So I'm going to put in a question. Let's just say, for sake of argument, it's going to be complaints against this franchisee. And you'll see why I'm going to kind of put this in, or I should say open complaints against this, because a little bit later we're going to use this particular question to show you a smart question. Now, the first tip and trick that we really have to do with question and response is this descriptive help text for user. Now, a lot of people have asked me, well, Frank, what do you use this descriptive help text for user? And I tell them, well, you know, one of the great things about it is to explain this question. What is it that you're trying to get them to do in this particular question? That is kind of a self-explanatory one when we say descriptive help text for user. Now, what I've also seen that's really, really awesome from other customers is that they will actually, within this, on top of the description for the question, they will put in their ops manual, manual reference 10.2, and then they will list it out right there from the ops manual or wherever manual they're using, what it is that is the particular metric that they're gauging against. So maybe in the ops manual it says something like no franchise should have more than one open complaint in info manager, or something like that. Okay, so what we've seen a lot from others is that they actually will quote the actual ops manual from here, as well as a descriptive help text. And that really helps your consultants, your field ops agents out there with where is it that they're actually able to look back to and quote from, and make sure that the owner, if the owner or the franchisee, when you go out, is like, I don't know where that's at in the ops manual, you can tell them, oh, it's section 10.2. Here it is in the manual right away. Okay, so that's our first tips and trick for that. Second, we have the option here to upload attachments. Okay, so if there's a situation in which this is referring to, let's say that the question isn't open complaints against the franchisee, but it is something like are appropriate signs in place. And that is your question that you're going through, and it's the lobby, and you're trying to so it might be the lobby here that they're actually going through here. So if you wanted to upload a particular picture, either from your media library, which we talked about last week, and then you can go into your media library here, and maybe it's the main lobby you want to upload here. You can upload it so that the person who is looking at the main lobby to check the signage would see an actual picture available to them. You can also upload from your own attachments by clicking here and upload a picture that shows the appropriate signage for this particular document. Okay? Any questions on the questions section here? Those are our main tips from the questions section here. Okay? All right, so now we're going to move on to the response section. And let's talk a little bit about the response. So the question side is fairly self-explanatory. You've got your questions. Your response is really how are you going to dictate what responses are acceptable. Now, we have several types of responses that I wanted to go to, and our biggest tip and trick for this is use a variety of responses. Use some dates, use some ratings, use some single select, use some check boxes. Pull in a smart question, multiple input. Try to use as many different kinds of question types and response types as you possibly can. Now, there are three types of responses. You've got your static responses. Static responses are things like single line text and paragraph text. They allow user comments and attachments to those particular sections if you so choose, but there really is not much to them. It is a text box with a single line or a paragraph text box. Okay. Now, as we get into, and date as well, as we get into some more dynamic questions, notice that our options really start to open up with these particular question types. The dynamic options are, of course, rating, numbers, single select radio, drop down, checkbox. Most of those, again, those question types are really covered in the basic field ops training. The one I really wanted to talk about, which I don't think is covered very well in the basic field ops training, is the smart question. The smart question really allows us to go in and help us to pull in data from other parts of the system so that we can see, for instance, if we're talking about only one open complaint and info manager, we can actually pull in and say, okay, for this particular smart question, from info manager, I want to pull in from the complaint section. I can get to it. A lot of fields in our training environment here. I want to see if there's any, what the complaint type is. Maybe I want to see what the complaint status is. Okay. And then I want to see, I can very much so go through and say, okay, I want to say yes. I want to include this question and value. I can say consultant can modify populated value if needed. Or I can say if question scores less than a specific option here. Let's say if it's less than 1. And then if I say, okay, if any of our question or complaints are open, we're going to assign an action to this particular, for this particular option here. Okay? So basically what's going on there is then we're going to say, okay, we're going to assign an action. And then we can populate our action with other ones. Now what this is going to do is that when the consultant is out in the field, they're going to see this smart question. They're going to see the customer complaints, complaint status in there. And if they have anything open, if any of their complaints are open, then it's going to give them a score of 1, or we could put it as 0 and just do for selected responses here. We'll put this at 0 just to make it easy. And it's going to, if any of these are open, then we can assign the please follow up on open complaint. And then, of course, select the priority just like you do with all other action types here. Okay? Or we could maybe even use a library selected response here, whatever the case may be. Okay? Action here. Okay? Those are our main tips and tricks as it pertains to your question and responses. So again, to kind of reboot that, in the question section, use that descriptive area here to make sure that you are putting in ops manual as well as description for the consultant exactly what's going on and what this particular question is for. Okay. And then within the response section here, make sure that you use a variety of questions, not just your static single line paragraph text or date, but use some of these rating numbers and then incorporate some smart questions to pull in data for each one of them. Okay. Any questions on the tips and tricks for questions and responses? All right. You guys do me a favor, and just because we have had some wonderful audio issues, do me a favor, raise your hand if you can hear me so that I know we are good to go. All right, Nancy can hear me. Good. So I think we're audio, and Jacqueline can hear me. So good. All right. I feel better about life now because and Monica can hear me. Great. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate that. I was real concerned with the fact that we had so many people not showing up. So I'm glad that we are on the right track here. So now, any questions, as I said, about question response best practice? If not, we're going to move on to visit form best practices. I'm not seeing any questions, so we're going to move on to the visit form. In order to do that, we're going to create a fake visit so that we can talk about some of the best practices within managing the visit form. So in order to do that, I stay in my admin section, field ops area here. I'm going to click on the manage visit form, and just like you've done before, we're going to click on add visit form. Now from here, we really have our first couple of tips as it pertains to visit form best practice. Okay, so the first one, let's just say fake form for FLM. Okay, and then the description, whatever your form is going to be, whatever description you want here. This also may be somewhere where you put an ops manual area in. The first piece that I wanted to talk to you about was the difference between the types here, single page and multi-page. A single page is going to give you the single page is going to give you for less organization of your questions. When we do multi-page, it's going to give you a tabbed view. So I'll show you once we get through this what that's going to look like. So instead of having 15 questions all in a row, you're going to have the ability to put the questions into separate tabs: interior, exterior, bathroom, walk-in freezer, cooler, whatever it is that you're going to be doing. But that way then you can really organize your ability to place questions into different sections, okay, into different tabs, if you will. Okay. The other tip, so we always recommend multi-page tabbed view because it just really helps with better space organization, better organization of questions for you, and it just is a nicer flow. The other option is list view or table view. And now notice, of course, when I make the multi-page versus single page, if I go over single page here and I take a look at list view versus table view, it shows you what it's going to kind of look like. Now, look at here's your list view, just all straight in a row. Okay, here's your table view with the single page. Now, when I change it to multi-page, look at how much nicer. Even if we're going to go with the list view, which I'm not a big fan of, or layout, or the table view, it really does look a lot nicer as far as organization to me. Okay. Now again, in the layout, we do not suggest the list view because what's going to happen is even within these tabs, it's going to simply list them all out. All right. Question, response, and it takes up a lot of space. In your table view, notice here what we're going to have is question on the left, response on the right. Really quite nice. The questions here will display on the right, and of course it will allow for your questions to be in a much better order as it is. It also, notice of course when I go from list view to table view, it does provide me with some other options down here to allow for column headers and so on and so forth. Okay, so we do recommend multi-page tab view and table view. Okay, now so any questions on those two responses and why we recommend those two over the others and why it would be helpful for you? All right, not seeing anything in the comments box, so I'm going to go on to the next page here and get into some design questions here. Now right here it kind of looks like you're done. Not quite, okay? What you're going to do here from here is you're going to add a tab. Now, one of the things within the tabs, let's just say test 1 and add. Now we've got a single tab at the top, and from here, what's really nice about the tabbed view or the tab view here is that even within the tabs we can create sections. So another tip for us is within your sections, interior, exterior, whatever, or within your tabs, create sections. Maybe the walk-in freezer section here or tab section can say, okay, let's say food temps in the walk-in. Okay, maybe another section might be something like a signage in the walk-in. So really continue to allow for further delineation within your form, within your visit form, to not only use the tabs with the multi-page, but also use sections to really delineate those questions and help your particular organization there. Last but not least in this particular area is to add questions. So I'm going to add questions underneath the food temp here. All right. Now, as we've talked about ad nauseum here, when we're talking about questions, which would be the best option, having to create a new question every single time, or having a bank of questions from the library and allowing for you to choose from them? Of course, our best tip on this particular scenario is to make sure that you use as many of the questions as you possibly can when creating your form from the library. Okay, so our last tip, of course, when it comes to our visit form is use as many questions from the library as you possibly can. So any questions on visit form best practices and tips before we move on to visit completion best practices? Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box, so we're going to move on to visit completion. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back into field ops because I've got some visits on my right here, scheduled pending visits, and I'm going to go ahead and actually go into a visit so that we can go over some of our best practices here. Okay, so now this is just a faux form that somebody's created in our training domain, and notice of course they've got the tabbed across here, which is the multi-page, and then of course we've got our sections that we've created. We've got various types of questions and so on and so forth. So this is a really good form for us to go over visit completion best practices. The first question, or the first thing that I wanted to talk to you about is, let's say that, excuse me, you go through the kitchen here and they've got the refrigerators are one, the stove, sink, freezer, grill. Everything looks decent, but a couple of these is not. All right. Now, if you're out in the field and the kitchen isn't quite up to the refrigerator and stove looks good, but they needed at least 3 out of 5 to make sure there wasn't an action item, but they didn't get the sink, the freezer, and the grill. You can attach a file, and we recommend that you attach a file for documentation purposes. So if you're going to assign an action to a particular franchisee, good idea to make sure that you take a picture of the sink, the freezer, and the grill and attach that file to the question, so that when the franchisee comes back and says, hey Frank, you know, Jack in the field said that these 3 things weren't good, but these 3 things are good in my particular restaurant. I'm not sure what's going on with that. Then you can go right to the attached file and say, well, yeah, look here, this particular picture, which is a desert right now, shows the sink, the freezer, and the grill were not actually all that great. Okay, so, and you can attach as many files as you want. Okay, so we've got our desert picture, our penguin picture, so on and so forth. And of course, I would attach a sink, a freezer, and a grill picture from the field op agent. Okay, so highly recommend that you put in your best practices, especially if it's an action item, that they attach a file, attach a picture of the actual problem, the problem areas when that particular field op agent is. This looks like Arizona right here, where I'm from. Nice. All right, now these are obviously just demo pictures, so they're not valid. But moving on, down here in our next tip, of course, is modifying your task during completion or the status based on compliance. So let's just say the field ops agent is in the store, and the sink, the freezer, and the grill, we've got three pictures of what they were, and the owner or the operator there is saying, you know what, let's get it cleaned up and boom, we're ready to go. You still want it documented at some point in time that there were problems, but we recommend that during the visit, if somebody is willing to modify those areas, you can still assign a possible task to this particular person, priority, so on and so forth. Okay, but maybe in your status here, you mark this as work in progress or completed. So, and then within, so work in progress, they're cleaning this up, and then you could say, you know, owner operator is working on this. Please follow up. And then, of course, a student one, or we'll put somebody who actually makes sense, would then have a task on their particular item to follow up with this particular person and say, hey, we're good to go. And then maybe a reminder could be set for that as well. Okay, so good tip to make sure that your field ops agents know you can modify this task within, you know, as either not started or maybe work in progress, or if they actually get it done, you still have the option to say, yeah, it wasn't done, but now this has been completed by the owner. Okay, so modify and teach your agents to modify the task based on, if that's part of your operations, make sure that you have the option to give them to modify as you go. Okay. All right. Next, also the other piece that we want to talk about as it pertains to action is make sure that you never have an action that is unassigned. Okay. When would be a good time to unassign or have an unassigned action piece? The only time that we ever recommend unassigned action is if it's if the consultant isn't sure who would be responsible for the completion at the time of the visit. But if the consultant has the necessity to push this as unassigned at the corporate level, make sure that they follow up and that they get it assigned to somebody at a later date and time. So never leave an action unassigned unless the consultant is absolutely sure that they have no idea who they could possibly assign this to at the corporate level or at the franchise level, at the corporate level, to make sure they follow up. If you leave it unassigned or you leave this as select, nobody's going to follow up on it, and obviously this is a point of contention or point of issue for the franchisee. Okay. One last tip in our visit form completion. Let's say that you have a two-day visit form, and day one has been completed, but you don't necessarily want to submit it for review for day one. You want to wait until day two is completely done. We recommend that you use the save as draft. A lot of corporate people don't know exactly what the save as draft button is. They've got submit, submit all, save as draft, cancel, and next. Submit means, of course, I want to submit this for review, and I am done with this particular section. Submit all means I'm going to submit not only these, but all of the entire area for review. And then save as draft means I'm going to save this but not submit it as of yet for review. Okay. So how do we use these three different buttons? Submit all is fairly self-explanatory. I'm done with this entire visit. I want to submit it. Boom, life is good. Submit says I want to submit just this particular section for review by corporate, but I want to hold off because this is a 2-day or 3-day review on the rest of it so that it gives me time to take a look and finish the rest of it. Save as draft says, you know what, I'm done with day 1, but I don't want to submit it for corporate yet. I want to look at my notes. I want to see what we've got. And so the person completing this particular form, your consultant or whatever, has the option to go back at night, look at their notes, whatever the case may be, and say, you know what, I'm going to save this as draft, and then maybe tonight after I've included all of my pictures and so on and so forth, we can submit or submit all at that particular time. So use these three buttons depending on your workflow. Submit means I'm just going to submit this one piece. Submit all, I'm submitting everything. Save as draft, not submitting anything to corporate yet. I just want to save it so I can come back and put my extra added notes on each one of these particular questions. Okay? And those are really our tips and tricks as they pertain to visit completion. Any questions so far on those three particular areas that we talked about? We talked about, again, just as a review, question response best practices, visit form best practices, and visit completion best practices. All right, I'm not seeing any questions as of yet, so I'm going to open up the line at this point. I'm going to go ahead and open up the line for any questions in the chat box on either session 1 or session 2. And if we don't have any questions, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Sorry about the technical difficulties that we had, but we will make sure that the recording gets to you, as well as all materials that we've had available to us. Please make sure that if you have any questions that you email us at the help desk so that we can make sure all of your questions get answered. Again, my name is Frank Menger. I'm happy to have spent time with you guys today. I will leave the chat box open for another, let's say, 2 or 3 more minutes just to see if you have any further questions on anything that has to do with field ops. And we invite you to join us at any given point in time down the road for any Ask the Experts session. Again, thanks for joining. Bye-bye. For those of you still hanging on, if you've got chat questions, go ahead and open up the chat. Or if you want me to unmute you, tell me in the chat, and I'd be happy to unmute you, and we can have a chat session as well.